He had taken the sacred vows, knelt before altar and crown, sworn his life to the rituals and hierarchies that had ruled England's soul since time immemorial, and yet, somewhere deep within the cloisters and shadowed halls of ecclesiastical power, something ancient began to crack. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. It was a whisper carried in pages smuggled, banned, trembling with heresy. A whisper written by men hundreds of miles away, whose names were spat like curses by the bishops of Rome, yet clung to in secret by the restless and the curious. Among these restless ones was John Hitten. At first glance, he was the very image of an English cleric, educated, devout, disciplined, wrapped in black robes and the incense of sacred tradition. But beneath the surface, something was changing, something irrevocable. Like many of his generation, those quiet minds burning behind solemn eyes, Hitten found himself drawn to the forbiddance. Not to vice, not to violence, but to words. The writings of Martin Luther, hidden in plain sight. Books passed from trembling hand to trembling hand, under candlelight and breathless silence, smuggled across the channel despite royal edicts and papal wrath. These weren't just ideas, they were detonations. Luther's words didn't ask permission. They didn't beg for reform. They kicked at the foundations. Faith, Luther wrote, wasn't handed down from bishop to priest, priest to peasant, in a golden chain of obedience. Faith was personal, immediate, terrifyingly free. Scripture was no longer the guarded treasure of Latin tongues and ink-stained elites. It was alive, raw, unfiltered, meant for every man and woman to confront directly, without the mediation of the holy caste. And for men like Hitten, the realization was like stepping into fire. He didn't leap. He smoldered. The transformation came in stages, slow, deliberate, agonizing. The way a man might peel away layers of armor he once believed sacred, only to find they were chains. As a scholar, he had read Augustine and Aquinas, debated theology with the kind of care only a man in fear of damnation can muster. But now, as Luther's radical ideas took root in his mind, those old pillars no longer held. The church, which once felt eternal and immovable, began to seem like a fortress built on sand. And the more he studied, the more the cracks widened. Indulgences sold like salvation in coin, relics paraded through towns like pagan charms. Illiterate priests who mumbled Latin they barely understood. And a hierarchy less concerned with souls than power. It was not simply corruption, it was spiritual fraud dressed in silk. To speak these thoughts aloud was treason, heresy, a death sentence in robes, yet Hitten did speak. At first, only in whispers, in trusted company, among fellow scholars whose eyes carried the same haunted question, what if we've been lied to? But whispers breed echoes, and echoes become thunder, he wrote. He preached, quietly at first, cloaking rebellion in theological subtlety, but as the fire grew within, the subtlety faded. And when Hitten began to write directly, clearly, boldly against the authority of the church, the line was crossed. He was no longer a priest with questions. He was a danger, because unlike the wild-eyed street preachers or anonymous pamphleteers, John Hitten knew the system. He had walked its halls. He knew its language, its weak points, its hypocrisies, and now he was turning that knowledge against it. To the ruling elites, this made him far more dangerous than any sword-wielding rebel. Heretics could be burned. But a respected priest, educated and eloquent, tearing down the system with his words, that was contagion. And like all contagions, it had to be eradicated. The bishops tried to silence him, of course. Letters were sent, inquiries made, warnings issued. But Hitten did not flinch. Instead, he went deeper. He aligned himself with underground circles, men and women willing to risk everything for this new truth. They printed illicit pamphlets in cellars, translated scripture by candlelight, held secret gatherings in forest clearings and hidden chambers. These were not fanatics. They were thinkers, seekers, dreamers haunted by the weight of deception. They believed, with an almost unbearable urgency, that England stood on the edge of a spiritual rebirth or a collapse. Hitten's writings spread like wildfire, and with every page, he painted a vision of faith not chained to Rome, but rooted in conscience. It wasn't just about religion anymore, it was about power. About who gets to speak to God and who gets to say what that means. But truth, in every age, has a price, and soon, the price came knocking. Late one night, under cover of fog, agents of the church raided a printing house in which Hitten's latest tracts were being copied. The printers were arrested. Some tortured, others vanished. Hitten escaped, but not unscathed. He would spend the next years in exile, hunted by the very church he once served. But he didn't stop. From safe houses in Antwerp and Strasbourg, he continued to write letters, treatises, theological firebombs hurled across borders and smuggled back into England like contraband gospel. And slowly, unbelievably, the tide began to shift. Not because of any single man, but because the questions had taken root. How much truth had been buried to preserve power? How many generations had bowed to ritual, never knowing the freedom of unmediated belief? And who, truly, had the right to stand between a soul and its creator? What made Hitten's legacy endure was not just his defiance, it was the fact that he had everything to lose. He wasn't a dissident from the outside. He was one of them. A product of the very hierarchy he came to dismantle. That betrayal, that awakening was what made him dangerous. And in that betrayal, he revealed a deeper, darker truth, that sometimes the most revolutionary acts come not from enemies of the system, but from its most devoted servants. History, it seems, has a strange sense of irony. And in the quiet rebellion of a single priest, we hear the distant echo of all who have dared to ask the forbidden question, what if everything we were taught to believe was a lie? They tried to erase him not just from history, but from memory. As if burning the body could cauterize the ideas. As if fire could silence what had already taken root in the minds of the hungry, the haunted, the half-awake. But John Hitten's execution was not an ending, it was a signal flare. A dark star rising over a kingdom on the verge of tearing itself apart. In the wake of his death, something began to shift. Quietly, relentlessly. It began in the places no one expected, among the common folk, the weary tradesmen, the women who lit candles not to saints, but to dreams they dared not name. Hitten's words lived on not in cathedrals, but in basements, in fields, in stolen pages passed from hand to hand, wrapped in linen and soaked in secrecy. They whispered his phrases like prayers laced with gunpowder. They no longer trusted the pulpit. They no longer feared the robe. And in that silent rebellion, something ancient reawakened. The idea that belief should not be dictated but discovered. But while the people mourned and murmured, those in power were watching. The monarchy was shifting again, its throne splintered by blood and ambition. And within the smoke-choked halls of political power, a new doctrine was forming, not spiritual, not holy, strategic. If the crown could not stop the flood of reform, it would redirect it, own it. Twist it. Turn the hunger for truth into allegiance to a new form of control. Protestantism not as liberation, but as nationalism cloaked in piety. It was no longer about Rome versus reform. It was about empire, uniformity, obedience under a new name. And so the English Reformation began not with purity, but with manipulation. Those who had once burned reformers now branded themselves reformers. And the same tools of suppression, the same tortures, silences, executions were wielded again, only the symbols had changed, and somewhere, buried beneath this shifting tide of loyalty and betrayal, Hitten's legacy was being rewritten, sanitized, hollowed. He was canonized by some, vilified by others, but understood by almost no one. Because the truth was too dangerous. The real Hitten, the man who warned not just of Rome's corruption, but of the idea of blind obedience, was inconvenient to all sides. Reformers who craved control, monarchs who demanded unity, churchmen who traded robes but kept their power. They all needed a Hitten who could be quoted, not followed. But deep within the margins of banned books and forgotten sermons, his voice still stirred. And it was there, in the dark, that the second wave began. It wasn't led by priests or nobles. It was led by midwives, teachers, runaway monks, ordinary souls who refused to forget. They didn't just adopt Hitten's theology, they embodied his defiance. They began to question not just religious dogma, but the very idea of hierarchy. Why should God speak only through kings and clergy? Why should truth be locked in universities and Latin tongues? Why were women silenced in the name of purity, the poor excluded in the name of holiness? These were not just theological questions, they were revolutionary. And in the fractured, paranoid world of post-Hitten England, revolution was the greatest sin of all. So the response was swift. Spies embedded in churches, informants paid in silver and salvation, entire villages punished for a single word spoken out of place. The state called it order, the people called it terror. And beneath it all was the same cold strategy: control the story, and you control the soul. But the truth was no longer so easy to bury. because now it had faces, names, martyrs who died not as enemies of God, but as victims of those who claimed to speak for him. Their stories spread not through sermons, but songs, not through decrees, but dreams. Hitten had lit the match. Now others were feeding the fire. And yet, for all the noise and fury, something more subtle, more sinister was unfolding beneath the surface. The new Protestant establishment began building its own myths, its own saints, relics, and rituals. The very things Hitten had condemned as chains were quietly reconstructed, brick by brick, under different banners, instead of Latin, English, instead of the Pope, the crown, but the effect was the same. The architecture of fear remained intact, only now it wore a different face. And in this betrayal, Hitten's ghost grew restless. Because this was never about changing the costume of power. It was about unmasking it entirely, and yet no one dared finish what he began. There were rumors, of course, of lost manuscripts written in exile, buried beneath ancient chapels or hidden in the walls of condemned abbeys. Pages said to contain Hitten's final revelations. Not theological treatises, but warnings, visions, descriptions of cycles he believed would repeat for centuries. Where every rebellion would be co-opted, every truth reshaped into a tool. He wrote of future ages where the language of freedom would become the currency of control. Where religion would evolve into ideology, and ideology into branding. Where the question would no longer be who is right, but who controls the story. And in these pages, if they ever truly existed, was one final claim. That the greatest danger was not corruption, not even violence, but forgetting that power, left unchallenged, always writes its own scriptures. Always paints itself as divine. And so, as England marched forward into its enlightenment, a strange unease lingered beneath the surface. A sense that something holy had been lost in the noise of reform. That somewhere, beneath all the doctrine and pride, the human soul had been traded for structure. That maybe, just maybe, the greatest heretic wasn't the one who challenged the church, but the one who believed he had nothing left to question. That's the shadow Hitten left behind. Not as a saint, not as a martyr, but as a man who tried to peel back the veil and show us what lies beneath our most sacred illusions. As the centuries passed, Hitten's legacy was folded into the grand tapestry of history, a footnote in the annals of English religious upheaval. Yet the shadows of his thoughts never quite dissipated. It was in the silence of forgotten libraries, the hushed corners of scholars' gatherings, and in the whispered conversations between those who dared to ask difficult questions that Hitten's true influence took root. His voice, though muted by time and violence, lingered like the faint echo of a bell that had long ceased to ring. His rebellion, born not of violence but of conviction, ignited a fire that refused to die out, even when those who feared it worked tirelessly to bury it. In this final chapter of his story, the truth becomes undeniable. The fight he began was not just a moment in history. It was an eternal struggle, one that transcended time, geography, and ideology. It was the fight against the idea that belief can be harnessed and controlled by power. By the time the 17th century arrived, the world had changed again. England's religious landscape had fractured further, and the old fears of Catholicism and Protestantism now stood alongside the nascent ideas of secularism and enlightenment. But even in this shifting tide, the words of John Hitten continued to pulse in the undercurrents of thought. His warning that truth, once seen, could not be unseen, had seeped into the intellectual soil of the time, giving rise to philosophers who began to question not just religious authority, but the very nature of power itself. The likes of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau would come to the forefront, and though they would never mention Hitten by name, they would echo his ideas. They would ask, what happens when society decides that it is no longer content with the chains of tradition? What happens when a person or a people begin to see the world as it is, not as it has been told to them? Hitten had been one of the first to answer that question, though his answer was not in the form of political theory or academic dissection. It was in the act of simply asking the question, of refusing to accept the world as it was handed down, of demanding to know who truly held the reins of authority. His life's work was a deep examination of the very nature of belief itself. Not just religious belief, but the belief in systems, in institutions, in the very structure of the world that people had learned to accept without question. And, in the centuries that followed, the seeds he planted would grow into something even more powerful. A revolution in the way humanity viewed not just religion, but the very act of questioning. Because, though many would come to see the rise of democracy, of individual rights, of personal freedoms. It was all rooted in that same simple act of refusal. The refusal to accept without asking, the refusal to live in a world where belief, truth, and power were handed down like an inheritance. By the 19th century, the winds of change were sweeping across Europe, and the old religious order seemed to be collapsing beneath the weight of scientific discovery, industrial progress, and political revolution. Yet, even as the world began to turn its back on the old certainties of faith, there was still an underlying unease. Was humanity truly free, or were we merely replacing one form of control with another? Was the very concept of freedom itself being twisted into something new, something that, once again, would demand unquestioning obedience to an unseen power? In the midst of this, a new generation of thinkers, philosophers, revolutionaries, and even artists began to wrestle with the very issues that Hitten had grappled with centuries before. His ideas had been forgotten by most, yet his questions, those dangerous, subversive questions, remained as relevant as ever. And even in the age of reason, of revolution, and of scientific advancement, there were still whispers of Hitten's radical thesis, that the true power in any society lies not in the leaders, not in the priests or kings or governments, but in the mind of the individual. That if you can control belief, you can control everything, and the greatest power is the ability to make people believe that they are free when they are not. To make them believe that they are seeing the world when, in fact, they are only seeing what they are told to see. It was during this period, as the foundations of modern society began to take shape, that a peculiar kind of clarity emerged. With each revolution, each shift in power, each scientific breakthrough, there was a deeper understanding of the human mind, of the psychological forces that shaped belief, and of the fragility of truth itself. But it was also a time when new forms of authority began to emerge, authority that wasn't defined by religion, but by the very tools that Hitten had once fought against. Media, education, technology, institutions that no longer needed the power of the pulpit or the sword to shape the masses. They simply needed the right narrative. And this was where the legacy of John Hitten comes into full view. He did not just challenge the power of the church. He challenged the very concept of authority itself. His ideas opened the door to an age of intellectual revolution, and the more we learn about history, the more we see his fingerprints on every questioning mind that followed. The legacy of his rebellion lives on not in the pages of dusty history books, but in the very core of modern thought. In the willingness of the individual to stand against the flow, to question the narrative. To refuse to accept that the truth has been decided for them. As the modern world marched forward, with all its complexities and contradictions, the lessons of Hitten remain ever present. In a time where information is power, where belief is commodified, and where truth is often manipulated, his questions still ring true. Who controls the story? Who defines reality? And who decides which truths are worth telling? The rebellion that John Hitten began in the 16th century was never truly about religion. It was about the boundaries of belief itself. It was about the dangerous, profound realization that once we stop questioning, once we stop seeking truth for ourselves, we have handed over our agency. We have given away our most precious freedom. And so, as we stand in the shadow of a modern world shaped by technology, media, and power structures that often seem too vast to challenge, we must remember, John Hitten's fight didn't end in a burning pile of ashes. It lives on in every act of defiance, every question asked in the dark, every mind that dares to confront the powers that be, not just with fists or fire, but with the relentless power of thought, because, like the fire that consumed him, the truth does not die. It only waits for the next soul brave enough to carry it into the light.